Okay, so this is a slide. I don't have too much time today to spend on all of these steps, but basically it is a 10-step process. And so as you work with any given community or department, first, this is the same 10 steps. Like I said, this has been being done for like the last 10 to 15 years. These steps are in a specific order for a specific reason. And sometimes you'll see, like on the last couple slides, it says copyright Greenplay or copyright GP-Red. That's not because you can't use it. We want everybody to use this, and we want it to be in part of every college curriculum in the United States or even the world. But the reality is they're put in a certain order in a certain way because we know from trying them different ways that this is the way that works. So to keep the integrity of the steps and keep the integrity of the graphics, that's why we have those copyright signs on there, just so that people understand that it wasn't just done haphazardly. One example of that is sometimes people will want to use a 3-level pyramid instead of 5. They think it's easier. And so we know from our work that we've tried it many times because people go, I only want to use 3. The reality is when you do that, everybody wants to rank everything either a 2.5 or a 3.5. So we need those 5 levels. It just seems to work better that way naturally. In this situation, there's a reason that each one of these steps come after the other. And I don't have time to go into the detail of the implementation today, but I want you to just kind of keep in mind that we're going to start with building that organizational values, vision, and mission. Then we're going to explain the pyramid. Then we're going to go through and identify categories of service. And I'll talk more about that in a second. We're going to sort those categories. After we do that, we start to talk about costs because we want to get the values and vision and mission part before we actually get into cost, because otherwise people get messed up and they start thinking about how much things cost to offer instead of should we be offering it. Okay. Then we want to get into the idea of establishing the goals. Then we go through and we take the other factors. That's when those other secondary factors come into play. And we take those into account because there's always extenuating circumstances, and we obviously need to account for those. Historical is a great reason. Political reasons, sometimes they just are what they are in our community, and we have to take that into account. We want to implement that, and then we want to evaluate how that's been working. So it takes about 3 to 4 months to work with staff. Typically it's a kind of about 3 or 4 touch points with staff. It's very orderly, and we do recommend that this is a facilitated process. It doesn't have to be a consultant. It can be somebody else from a different department that understands the agency, somebody who's perceived to not have some sort of extra grind or some sort of subjective piece as to why they're involved. It should not be the leader of the organization running this. Shouldn't be the council members, because it's supposed to be that consensus process where we have all 3 of those groups working together. And if you have somebody who feels it kind of has some, something in the game, then often the outcomes are perceived to be biased. And so the big piece about this is to make sure that it's objective and well facilitated. We do consider this a public process. We want to represent the community. In order to do that, we have to have community members involved. We often bring in people who are in charge of sports associations or faith-based organizations or other alternative providers, parents, seniors, whoever is going to be affected by any type of reallocation. We want to make sure that they have a voice in the process. And so it is each one of these sorting meetings that we'll talk about bring people in to help be part of that. I've talked about categories of service, and this is important. So when we get into implementation, we want to make sure that we have all of the different categories recognized. And I will say, after having done this now for quite a while, almost everything that a parks, recreation, open space, trails related agency, and they're all different, they all have different things, almost everything that's offered will usually fit under these categories. And so quite often I ask people to say, well, give me an example. I haven't found many that don't fit under this. Now, a couple of things that you'll see, we have, for example, activities, beginning, intermediate, and competitive, broken into 3 different categories of service. Typically in public parks and recreation, we are there, our mission is to serve the beginning level, the entry level, get people off the couch, get people involved and teach them to do things. We are typically not subsidized by tax dollars to do that competitive level. So we want to keep those, often we will rank those differently, and they have a different placement on the pyramid. You'll see that we don't have in here activities youth, activities senior, activities adult. Now, sometimes in some communities, there will be an identified mission that organization should specifically serve youth or should specifically serve seniors. Most often, that is not the case. Most often, the agency is charged with serving all ages. And so that's a discussion to have up front as you're identifying categories. You can always create separate categories if that is part of your mission to treat those divisions separately. But if not, I would recommend that you don't use the age categories because it gets messy. Sometimes we include them just so people can see that they all end up on the same level of the pyramid. Usually it's by beginning, intermediate, and advanced. A couple other things that are not just self-explanatory here. Exclusive use typically means rental. That's when that service is offered for somebody to specifically use a room or a field or something like that. So if there's ever any questions, feel free to ask us. But these are the basic categories. And what we're going to do is take those categories, and each one for that agency, through that consensual process with all of those stakeholders representing the different factions, are going to come in and rank these categories for that specific community. When we do the sorting, we typically do it in facilitated small groups, and they come back together, and then we balance those all out for the whole group, and we come up with a community-wide pyramid. Here's what the community says should be, how they should be sorted on that pyramid. This is the part, the beauty of this process is the discussion. You will find long-term differences in values that people are just operating on as key assumptions, and well, it's always been this way. And it may be two people who have both worked in the organization for 40 years but have very, very different understandings as to why. If you get new decision makers, it's often very helpful because you'll find out where their values are coming from. So it really does help identify where people think things should be. Again, back to developing the consensus. That's the whole key here. It is a public, transparent process.